Good morning. Welcome to Newsmakers. Americans like to think of themselves as champions of democracy. Internationally, we hold ourselves up to third world countries as a model to be emulated. Ironically, inside the United States, signs abound that participatory grassroots democracy is on the decline. Fewer and fewer eligible voters bother to go to the polls. Opinion surveys find that a growing number of people cynically dismiss politics as corrupt or irrelevant to their lives. Many political scientists and political observers see a direct link between the increase in the amount of money spent in political campaigns and the decline in participation and confidence. Cincinnati City Council campaigns in the 1990s have become a microcosm of those trends. In the last two council races, soaring costs of TV commercials have driven total campaign costs to $4.5 million. Two candidates, Republican Phil Heimlich, who spent $641,000, and his running mate, Charles Winburn, who spent $562,000, shattered all earlier records. And make no mistake, their spending worked by catapulting both non-incumbents into the win column in 1993 and fueling a second-place finish for Heimlich in 1995. What is the impact of all that money on political life in Cincinnati? What can we expect this year as council swings into the full campaign mode? To establish the context for discussing the current state of funding council campaigns, I am joined this morning by two guests. Harriet Wilson has been active with the League of Women Voters for 40 years and chairs the League's study committee on council finance reform. Bill Woods is a principal with Applied Information Resources and just completed a report on the history of campaign finance reform in Cincinnati entitled Renewing Democracy at the Grassroots. Welcome to 12 Newsmakers.
Good morning.
Bill, let's start out by trying to put some numbers on this. Can you just give us a little bit of a review of how spending has increased over the last 5 council campaigns? And there's going to be a chart that our viewers will be able to see to help with that.
Yeah, that's when you really, Dan, see this startling growth in campaign spending. And you know, in our report, we go back to the 70s and 80s where you started to escalate in terms of spending. But it was really from around 1987 through 1995 where you saw this rapid, almost startling growth in campaign spending. 958,000 spent in 1987, escalating up to about 2.4 million in 1995. The tip-off year was 1993 that really began to startle people, where you had about 2.1 million being spent, and you quoted the spending by Mr. Heimlich and Mr. Winburn, two non-incumbents who won, and many think partially because they could put that much money, $300,000 and $200,000 plus, into the campaigns.
In terms of why that has ramped up so rapidly, why are campaigns so expensive? Where do people put all of that money?
Well, as we're sitting here on television, it really is television that has done it. And of course, you had television ads as early as the 1952 conventions. And so it sort of began to rise slowly. But it's really been in the 80s and the 90s where you've seen almost an obsession with strategies of getting as many TV ads on television in mounting the case that the city is having to take to keep this one ordinance that puts a cap on campaign spending. I believe they got some good testimony from Jerry Galvin, who showed some figures that you really can, by buying up large blocks of campaign time, almost bump people out of the picture. And so I think that's pretty disturbing.
And sitting here at a commercial television station where we sell a lot of that advertising, I mean, let's be honest about it, that's part of the business from our perspective. Harriet, with the League of Women Voters, the League has been involved in efforts to try to control, to reform these campaign spending on a local level for quite some time. But to help people understand that, there is a federal case that is constantly referred to, Buckley versus Vallejo, which was decided back in the mid-1970s. What's the essence of that ruling by the United States Supreme Court, and how does that affect local issues?
Well, it says that there needs to be no limit on contributions. I'm sorry, no limit on, yes, that's right, on contributions made by individuals who use their own money, and for independent expenditures, money that is raised but that doesn't go through political parties and established campaign committees. But that there can be no limit on expenditures because that infringes on First Amendment rights, the freedom of speech.
So,
in that decision, they were equating money as being speech. And there was an interesting letter to the editor in one of the papers not long ago referring to the fact that certainly Perot and Senator Woodby from California, who spent so much money, must have had more rights than the rest of us do because they spent so much money. But the Vallejo case, Buckley versus Vallejo, has had an impact here because council passed an ordinance in 1995 which would have capped expenditures, the amount of money that council was going to spend to run, anybody would spend to run for a council seat. And that amount was pegged at about 3 times the annual salary of a council person. They knew going in that it was likely that that it could be challenged under the Buckley versus Vallejo decision. So it came probably as not much of a surprise to council when this happened. And John Cruzy, a former council candidate, has sued the city for an ordinance that is unconstitutional. So that case is gone through the first federal court, and the Judge Weber decided that it was moot, that it did in fact belie the facts of the Buckley versus Vallejo case.
we're going to be running out of time on this segment. I just want to, because of what I want to set up for the second segment, Bill, I want to ask you a question, and you've alluded to it already. All of this money and all of the legal issues that Harriet has just been explaining, cut through all of that, what impact does any of that have on the quality of our political life from your perspective?
I think you alluded to it in your opening remarks, Dan. I mean, what we're talking about is really renewing or saving the democratic process. I think sometimes there's a disconnect that people make between democracy and actual politics. Well, the two have to go together, and you have to have people believing in it. And over, I think, since really the 1960 campaign, you've had steady drop-off in voter voting, people even registering to vote. That's been at the local, state, and national level, so that's been a steady erosion. And in terms of citizen participation in politics, I think you've seen the same thing.
Citizen participation meaning?
People getting involved in campaigns, everything from stuffing envelopes to telephoning and that type of thing. Because of the emphasis now on kind of passive people sitting at home watching 30-second sound bites, it kind of takes away the whole participatory activity that seems to be such a vital part of any kind of democratic process.
The sort of the thing that we've traditionally called democracy.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I know this has all been quick, but this has helped establish some parameters, and we're going to take a break now and then move on. Thank you very much. Stay with us. After the break, I will be joined by two people deeply involved with the effort to fund city council candidates. Welcome back. The amount of money it takes to fund a campaign seems staggering to ordinary people and repulsive to idealists, but electoral politics is populated by realists. Serious candidates and their closest advisors know that without at least $120,000, $130,000, a non-incumbent is whistling in the dark. And without $200,000 to $250,000, an incumbent has little hope of becoming mayor in Cincinnati. To discuss the issue of council campaign financing from the perspective of combatants, I'm joined this morning by two realists. Joe Allen is a local land developer and former chairman of the Conservative Forum, which plans to have about a $100,000 campaign fund available to invest in this year's council campaign. Don Mooney is a longtime Democratic activist and one of the attorneys representing the Democratic and charter parties in their effort to legally defend the current campaign finance law. Welcome to Newsmakers.
Hi, Dan.
Joe, just to start out, I don't think people who aren't close to politics know what the Conservative Forum is, and because it's become a real force in local politics. What is the Conservative Forum?
Conservative Forum is a group of individuals that have gotten together to raise money to support a particular candidate or issue. Right now, I believe we have about 50 members from basically all walks of life, most of them from private industry, that get together and discuss issues and then take positions on issues, and we also have fundraisers and help support political candidates.
The title of this, the Conservative Forum, is obviously you don't randomly select candidates. Realistically, in the city council race at the moment, who are you interested in supporting?
Well, I really don't know yet necessarily on what we're going to do this year. I can tell you what we've done in the past. Conservative Forum started, I believe, in 1989, and we were one of the instrumental forces behind passing term limits. We've supported Nick Fear's campaign, Phil Heimlich's campaign, John Dowland's campaign, Bettinghouse's campaign, and I think a few others. So our criteria is it does have to be a conservative issue. It doesn't have to be a candidate necessarily. It has to be a conservative issue or candidate that we'll support.
And my understanding is that your goal is to have $100,000 to put into the campaign this year. Is
That's
that
right.
correct?
Our goal is to raise $100,000 this year. What we do with it, whether we spend it this year or hold it to some other time, has not been decided yet.
Don, is there anything comparable to the Conservative Forum on the Democratic side?
Well, every now and then a few of us get together and throw a few bucks on the table and
buy
buy ourselves coffee. But other than that, no, we don't have that. I think that the Hamilton County Democratic Party and other groups who are interested in that obviously do not have the resources in this county that Republicans and conservatives do. It's just a matter of community history. And quite frankly, at least in city council elections, we haven't needed to apply that sort of resources and leverage to control a majority of city council. Now in the county races, that's different. It's a Republican county, and although we've had a few breakthroughs from time to time, it's tough to beat the Republicans in Hamilton County.
You know, it's not just a question of amounts of money. We've been talking about
Sure.
gross amounts. It's also a question of who gives that money. And I think that there are some statistics that indicate
Right.
that there's some real differences here.
Actually, in preparation for this lawsuit that you've talked about, we did an analysis of who gives money to council races. And we looked at the last 2 or 3 election cycles in city council. What we found is that 45% of the money, which is about $1 million, comes from only about 756 people, which is less than 1% of the region's population. Of course, a lot of those people don't even live in the city. And another 15% or so comes from political action committees like the Conservative Forum and also like labor unions who have a tendency to support Democrats. So you have a very small base of people directing resources to these campaigns. And it's not surprising that the public is a little cynical because they know that when one of those 756 people calls Councilman Winburn or Tillery, the odds are they're going to respond to that call quicker than if it was just some citizen concerned about a pothole on his street.
You know, Joe, raising that, Cincinnati has not had in recent years the sort of vote-buying scandal, the big thing that maybe is plaguing the Washington at the moment. We haven't had the really embarrassing point. But these figures that Don just brought out, that there are individuals and family groups, and one of those being, for example, the Lindner concerns, among those 756, invested huge amounts of money. Does that bother you that those kinds of concentrations of money, those people, those individuals, those groups, like the Conservative Forum, have access that ordinary people don't have?
Yeah, it does. It bothers me not only in the local elections, but it also bothers me in this past presidential election. When you look at all the money that's foreign money that's come in and support the president's campaign and what was done to raise that. It's a problem not only in the city of Cincinnati, but it's a problem throughout. And the issue you get into, and I think that was the main issue behind the Cruzy suit, was this freedom of speech. What can you do? I think the courts have been pretty clear on you can't stop somebody, a campaign from spending a certain amount of money. And if you do that, you're infringing on their free speech. You know, the biggest contributor to this particular issue of this campaign finance has been the city of Cincinnati taxpayers, and that they've been, because of this lawsuit, challenging the Cruzy case from the city of Cincinnati, and they're defending of it. They're going to be spending over almost $500,000 on that of taxpayer money. And you got to be careful, and I think a lot of ways the city of Cincinnati Democratic majority on the term limits and also on this Cruzy case, they're looking towards protecting their own incumbency, and that's pretty dangerous too when you spend all this money and all this power trying to retain a council seat.
Don, what about that? Couldn't you make an argument? Isn't it a legitimate argument to say that efforts to control campaign funding is just a democratic way to try to put a cap on your political opponents? It has nothing to do with right or democracy or law or any of those. It's just the smart tactic is for Democrats to stop Republicans from spending their money.
I think that it's broader than that. I think the polling that we did in preparation for this lawsuit and to show Judge Weber that this is a real public concern showed that about 80% of the people in Cincinnati, and a lot of them I'm sure are Republicans, are concerned about the fact that they believe these big contributors have more influence and sway than ordinary people. So they favor these spending limits. They're tired of seeing this juggernaut of campaign commercials every 2 years that interferes with the ability of them to try to filter out what the candidates are actually saying.
But the reality is that the law is what it is for the moment, and
Sure.
we're now moving into campaign season.
Mm-hmm.
Don, what's it going to take for, let's say, an incumbent Democrat who maybe isn't totally locked? I mean, Roxanne Qualls is a different issue. She's running for mayor.
Sure.
But let's take somebody like Minette Cooper, who's only been on one term. What's it going to take for her to retain that seat this year?
Well, what's interesting about that, I think that shows that this argument that you need an unlimited amount of money to get elected to council isn't true. Last year, Minette Cooper had never run for public office. She's really a relative newcomer to the community. She had a decent message to present. She spent about $95,000, which is substantially less than what the $140,000 cap would have been. And she was elected, and not only that, she came in the middle of the field. She wasn't dragging tail at the end of the field, sneaking into the council. So I think it shows that you can, if you have the right message and a reasonable amount of resources, you can get elected to council. You do not need to spend $250,000 in a way massaging your ego more than anything to show that you can come up near the top the way Councilman Winburn did.
Do you think that Minette Cooper can realistically target to run another race at $95,000 and feel comfortable that she'll win again?
I think now she's been in council for 2 years, and people are going to judge her the way they've judged other council members in the past based upon their record. So I don't think she has to spend that much money. What's more important to the public is, what have you done for us in the last 2 years? They gave her the chance, and I think when they look at her record, what she's done, the odds are she's going to do very well.
Joe, on the way that money is spent, I mean, we've said that it's spent on 30-second TV commercials. That's where the bulk of it goes. Lots of people say those commercials are either, fluff or they're deceptive. And we've come, I think viewers have gotten a little bit more sophisticated about that, but still, that's the way they are. Does it bother you that you're raising money, that's where it's going, and it's not really necessarily promoting the sorts of issues that you say you're concerned about? In your case, conservative issues.
It does, and that's true. And most of the money is spent on television, and what people want to do is raise their voter identification. The more they're on commercials, I guess it's like selling detergent or anything else. The more they're on there, the more their people will recognize them. And sometimes when people go in to vote for 9 candidates, they just remember a name, they've heard it enough, and they'll vote for them. And that is disturbing. So what I think the grassroots political activity is now even more important, because you really do have to also get that message out too. It's not only the name ID with the associated commercials and so forth, but it's important also to get a message out that can be equated with the candidate, so the candidate does pursue some of those topics. You know, one thing, and I haven't heard it talked about much, and what happens is, and it's not only this way with the city of Cincinnati, but it's on all these things, it's almost like one election cycle is done and then the other starts. Something that may want to be looked at is a 4-year cycle for council candidates. I think when they decided the 2-year cycle, the campaigns probably started in September and they went to November and they spent a little bit of money. Something we could do to maybe cut the thing in half, maybe it wouldn't be that much, but cut it down quite a bit, is go every 4 years. I think we'd have better candidates or better council people then also, because they'd spend less time trying to get elected.
Don, are there other practical ideas like that? Whether you agree with that one or not, I don't want to. But
I think that quite frankly, there are some things you can do to improve the process. So you mentioned TV ads. Well, some ads are terrible, and no matter how much money you spend, they hurt you. And one example, Nell Serber, who's a wonderful person, was an excellent city employee for many years, and probably was a good council member. She had an ad on a few years ago that featured barnyard animals in it, and I recall, and I think every time it ran, it probably lost her vote. So there is a certain amount of common sense that comes into play. I think people out there can look at the image you're trying to present to them and say yay or nay based on that image. So the more money you have, it doesn't necessarily turn into more votes. 4-year terms, trouble is I think that would just give people 4 years to raise even more money. I don't necessarily think that solves the problem.
What about the proposal that we go to some districts, and if you broke the city up into districts, buying expensive TV time that goes to a 19-county area makes less and less sense. Therefore, at least for those races that are just in the College Hill, Mount Airy, Westwood area, people wouldn't buy TV ads. They'd go back to doing door by door. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't know. I think it's been talked about and studied, and it ultimately may be a good idea, or possibly some combination of that, having some direct election and having some districts. That's something to maybe to look at. But I want to agree with Don on one thing, that these commercials sometimes, if repeated over and over again, can have a negative effect. And a good example of that would be with this past congressional election, where the labor union spent literally millions of dollars in our own district, as they did other districts, trying to beat our Congressman Steve Shabbat. I think at the beginning those things started to take effect, but the more people saw them, and I was even talking to Democrats and union members, they got so sick of it and so sick of the saturation that it turned against it and actually helped Steve Shabbat get elected. So you can't overkill it with a bad commercial, or really any commercial. People think you're trying to buy an election, so you have to be careful there.
Don, realistically, this year, let's take a look at the mayor's race, and we only got a few minutes left here. What's it going to take for to run an effective race for mayor, which we don't even have an official race for mayor in this city? It's just whoever ends up first. What's it going to take? What's it going to cost this year?
I think it will take about half of what they'll end up spending. I mean, people know who Roxanne Qualls is. They know Phil Heimlich from watching the news and reading the newspapers. In my opinion, both of them could spend $100,000 and have just as good a chance getting elected mayor as they do spending $300,000.
And what will they
spend? More than $300,000. My bet is that Mr. Heimlich will probably spend about $350,000.
And what do you think
Roxanne will spend about $200,000, and who knows how it'll come out.
Okay. And what do you think? You think that those are right numbers?
That's probably right. It's too bad, but it's probably correct.
And if you locked in on a non-incumbent who's not in council right now, what would you tell them they have to spend? What's the minimum floor to get on, to break in?
Well, John Cruzy, I don't recall what he spent the last time. I think it was over $200,000, and he did not get elected. He finished close, and if he runs again, he probably would get elected. But I would think a couple $100,000 would be the minimum.
And my sense is this, and John Cruzy seems like a fine human being, but you look at John Cruzy, he's spending as much money as he did. You look at Minette Cooper, who basically said, I have a history, I've done things in this community, I have something to offer, and people elected Minette even though she spent less than half. that
Well,
Mr. Cruzy's been.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, and it's going to be a long campaign season. We'll have you back.
Okay.
Keep talking about
Thank you.
this. Thank you for joining us. Remember, just complaining about politics doesn't change anything. The only way to stop the dumbing down of the process at the hands of the 30-second commercial is to get personally involved. And the easiest place to get involved meaningfully is in local races. Join us again next week.